whenever I told people about his representation of a black man charged with rape in South Alabama and him taking the case, people said, oh, that was To Kill a Mockingbird. So to continue what I wrote, and by the way, I've done this in quite a few venues now, which is nice. I'll be glad when it's done. This is, as I say, special. I'm going to try not to get choked up, but honestly, being here is special. For a while, the thought that the defendant's lawyer in Mockingbird could have been modeled on Foster Campbell Beck. My father was enough for me, when even Harper Lee, in a gracious letter forwarded to me by her agent, acknowledged the, quote, obvious parallels, adding that she could not, quote, recall my father's case, and that her work was, quote, fiction. I decided it was time to find out more. My manuscript was accepted for publication by W.W. Norton, the New York publisher, before the publication of Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman. And that book brings to mind the question, who is the real Atticus Finch? The beloved lawyer in Mockingbird, or the paternalistic bigot of Watchmen? The truth is, there were both kinds of Atticus, and many variations of them in South Alabama in those days. Some have insisted, especially my friends from up north, that the Atticus of Mockingbird was an idealized Southern white man who never existed. They never met Morris Dees. And that the racist Atticus of Watchmen is the accurate portrayal. But of course, that's not the whole truth. Not only Morris, but my father, Frank Johnson. There were other good Southern white men who courageously did the right thing. My father never subscribed to racist reading materials, never attended a meeting of the White Citizens Council or the Klan. He despised both organizations, and I remember him. I never heard him refer to Negroes, as African Americans were properly called when I was growing up, as, quote, backward or, quote, in their childhood as a people, which is what the Atticus of Watchmen said. Or say anything at all like that. On the other hand, like the Atticus of Mockingbird, my father forbade use of the N-word, accepted farm produce from indigent clients in payment for legal work, and most importantly, courageously defended a black man wrongfully accused of raping a white woman in 1938, South Alabama. So if you miss the Atticus of Mockingbird, if you feel sad about the Atticus of Watchmen, keep reading. This is a true story, and one in which all of us Alabamians can be proud. Just a couple more paragraphs, and then I'm going to get into the case. What follows is based not only on conversations with my parents, but also on my father's handwritten family history. Is someone here from the archives department, by the way? Sir? What's your name? May I ask? You're the man who helped me. Thank you so much. This is a great public servant. When I wrote Harper Lee about this case, and she said, I don't think you can find anything in the newspapers. They'd be afraid to publish it. Where's Ann? Your newspaper would have published it, but some might have been. But that's what Harper Lee thought. Her father, was a newspaper publisher. And she said, Joe, I just don't think you'll find any information about the case in the newspapers. Well, thanks to Ed, we found quite a few articles in the Montgomery paper and both Journal and the Advertiser, and also in the Troy Messenger. There was even an article in the Tuscaloosa paper. I guess the Crimson Tide was not playing that weekend, but slow news day, but they even covered it. So there was a lot of publicity, and that's one of the things that suggests to me that while I take Ms. Lee at her word that she doesn't recall my father's case, I think she may have had it in the back of her memory when she was 12 years old, because her father was a newspaper publisher and it was all over the press. And I'm going to tell you why in a moment. Anyway, I wanted to stop and thank you publicly for your great help. You were terrific. So it's based on my father's handwritten family history, newspaper articles about the case, the transcript of the trial, which we got through you, and the Alabama Supreme Court opinion, which is in the Southern Reporter. All that is factual. As I was not born until 5 years after the trial, sometimes I must surmise from my knowledge of my family and the times, what may have been said, what surely was said. I believe that content to be factual as well, even though the words have not previously been set down on paper. Foster Beck was dying when he began work on our family history, and he had just begun describing the case when his handwriting stops in the middle of this sentence. The prosecution produced testimony that the defendant was purported to be and he stopped. Fortunately, I remember him telling me a lot more about State of Alabama versus Charles White, starting with how the case came to him. How the case came to him was that the lawyers in Troy who could try a case, and they were all white men, had themselves appointed special prosecutor. Now, that created a conflict of interest. They couldn't represent the defendant if they were the special prosecutor. They didn't have to be special prosecutor. They had a solicitor. There was no need for it, but it gave them an excuse. And the judge might have been able to override that, but he also may have had some sympathy for them. And he also knew there was a good young lawyer a few miles down the road from Enterprise who came from a progressive family, a family known to be sympathetic with, at least for the time, progressive. And so he called my father and said, I want you to take the case. And Daddy sort of sat back on his heels at first because his practice was struggling. He said, I want to think about it, but he didn't think long. And he could have gotten out of it, but he didn't want to once he'd made up his mind. The judge said, Foster, don't worry about this case. It's not going to go to trial. Just read the Troy Messenger, which folks in Enterprise took the Troy Messenger. It was sort of the New York Times of that part of the world. And as compared to the Enterprise newspapers, I took both of those to do this book. And so Daddy had the Troy Messenger, and here's the headline, all caps. Negro rushed to Kilby prison after attack. Now y'all know where Kilby is, and you know why he was taken out of jail in Troy for his own protection. I give the judge, Judge Parks, credit for that. He was a good judge trying to protect him. Here's the first sentence. A wandering Negro fortune teller, giving the name C.W. White, was removed from the Troy jail for safekeeping following his attack on a local white girl. At Kilby, the Negro volunteered a detailed confession of the attack, and the confession was reduced to writing and signed in the presence of numerous law enforcement officials. A physician called to attend to the girl later confirmed that the Negro had accomplished his dastardly purpose. You know, I taught journalism class for 4 or 5 years at Emory, along with the class you mentioned in the law school. And the journalism students were kind of shocked by that. It was like, what about the presumption of innocence? What about a fair trial? The newspaper had already convicted him. But not quite. It didn't go that way. So my father drives to Kilby, about a day drive if the road was wet. And he met with his client for the first time. Now, y'all, how many of you have read the book When Done Gone? I'm sorry, I'm thinking another one of my cases. Have read To Kill a Mockingbird or seen the movie? Just about everybody. Yeah, I did have a case involving Gone with the Wind and The Wind Done Gone. If I have time, I'll talk about it. But this book, To Kill a Mockingbird, is a whale. It still sells about 3 million copies a year. It's required reading in junior high schools all over America. So you know, and everybody knows a little bit about Tom Robinson. He was a meek, polite, some would say obsequious. That's not fair because black men had to behave that way back then if they wanted to live. But he was a very polite guy, deferential. Charles White was from Detroit and Chicago. He didn't act that way. He wasn't used to that. So I'm reading, as it was reconstructed to me by my father and as my memory serves, how that first meeting went. Charles, you say it didn't happen the way she says, but why'd you sign that confession? You don't know? They say I don't sign, they turn around and take me straight back to Troy that night. They say I'm dying on a rope that night. If I sign, they promise I can stay here in this place, Kilby, till the trial, then I can come back here and serve out my sentence. My father, who promised? Mr. White. 5 white men, sheriff, deputy, 3 others. My father, maybe we can suppress the confession on the ground it was coerced, but if we succeed, the state may try to seek the death penalty. Are you all right with a life sentence? I don't want to go to jail for life for something I didn't do. If you plead in exchange for a promise of life, my father says, not the chair, at least you'll be alive. Not how I want to live, Charles White said. Charles, I may be able to bargain for less time than life and make you eligible for parole. Charles, I'm not entering a plea. I want that confession suppressed. Well, my father, this is not the kind of African American that my father often represented. They were like Tom Robinson. It's a different kind of man. Well, my father begins, I think that'll be up to the judge whether to suppress, but do something for me, lawyer. Charles White interrupted. So the first meeting was a little tense. I'm sure Charles White had his doubts about his appointed lawyer. My father, though, came to greatly respect and be really fond of Charles White. They were, by the end, good friends. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Troy. I've got my friend Judy, used to be Pierce, now Judy Green from Troy came up. Thank you for being here. Troy's a great town now. It's got a great university. I listen to Troy Public Radio on my car driving from Auburn. It was a little different back then, as was Montgomery, as was Boston and New York. John Lewis, my congressman, in his wonderful book, Walking with the Wind, recalled wondering as a little boy why his mother said, you must be very, very careful not to get out of line with a white person. By the time he was ready for elementary school, he could see for himself why she warned him, because by then I had been to Troy. John, Congressman Lewis, a great American hero, was good enough to speak for my father at Emory, one of the 5 lectures we sponsored. He was the concluding lecturer, and he was born a year and a half after the trial. He goes on to talk about Troy in terms that are a little disparaging. You can read about it if you want to. As I say, the town has changed a lot. There was a statue of John Wilkes Booth that my mother commented on. John Wilkes Booth, of course, the man who murdered Abraham Lincoln in Troy. But, and Judy, correct me, but I think it's true that was never a public commissioned statue. It was a privately commissioned work by a man who claimed that his brother was mistreated in a Union prison. In any event, the city fathers and mothers of Troy, I'm sure, thought it was really bad publicity to have a statue of John Wilkes Booth, so it's gone now, I think. They got the trial back then, Morris, really quickly. It was about a month. On July 13, 1938, the Troy Messenger reported, quote, the Negro was brought to Troy Wednesday morning by a 7-member detachment from the Alabama Highway Patrol. Sounds like they're bringing in somebody from Al-Qaeda. These men were joined by additional officers stationed in Troy. According to the Messenger, there was no outward display of proposed violence that Wednesday during jury selection, but as a precaution, Charles White was escorted back to Kilby on Wednesday evening by the Alabama Highway Patrolman. Judge Parks was, I'm just writing now what I was told. Judge Parks was prudent to insist that Charles White be escorted to and from Montgomery and that the Alabama Highway Patrol be present during jury selection. There was high talk in the crowd surrounding the courthouse when the word got out that 2 Negroes had been called for jury service in compliance with the Scottsboro ruling, which those who are not lawyers probably know anyway. Scottsboro was the infamous prosecution of some black teenagers for allegedly molesting 2 white girls on a train. Didn't happen. The case went to the Supreme Court twice. And in the second case, the United States Supreme Court said you have got to call African American, blacks, Negroes, for possible jury service. That was the law from that time forward. And there were a series, 2 or 3, at least 2, I guess Batson was the last, statutes and decisions requiring that to be done. But you know what? It was not until this last June that the United States Supreme Court finally, in a case that, I'm ashamed to say, came out of just outside of Atlanta, Marietta, where the district attorney had coded the jurors' names to indicate who was black and who was white. And all the blacks were excused from service under various, they said, well, we don't want any school teachers, but they took white school teachers. We don't want anybody that young. Black man was 35, white woman 28. Clearly racial discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court unanimously set us, and that's rare in that court, unanimously set aside the conviction and sent it back to do it right or let the man go. It's taken that long. So, yeah, they were called. And the crowd got upset when they heard they were called, but the talk subsided, the high talk, and a cheer went up when it was reported that both Negroes had been struck by the state of Alabama. Judge Parks finally succeeded in impaneling a jury of 12 white men. Just a quick comment on that. Women were not allowed to serve on capital juries back then. Go figure. The things I remember most vividly from my father, and he seemed almost embarrassed that he lost the trial, not to, spoiler alert, I guess I should say, but he really felt his client was innocent. And I remember him saying, son, women could not serve on the jury. And something about his articulation of that, the way his voice came out, his demeanor, suggested to me that he thought if he had had a couple of women on the jury, it might have helped. And if you read the book, or when you read the book, and you read or speculate, as I have to do, what did go on between this black man and white woman, you may agree that a woman might have been more sympathetic to the defendant. In any event, each of the white men swore he could render a fair and impartial verdict in a black-on-white rape case. The judge ordered the jurors kept together for the evening under the direction of Special Bailiff Henry Bauer, the messenger reported, so as to avoid any taint of outside influence. The precaution turned out to be a wise one. That night, darkness and liquor emboldened some of the rough element to slip the leash and prowl the streets of Troy, looking for stray Negroes to bully and assault. One of the things I try to do in this book, I don't know what my father would say about this if he were living, but I try to show that there are all kinds of Southern white people. Of course, I write mostly about men because that's what I am. I try to include the most fabulous woman of my life, my mother. But there were some poor whites who really were good people. There were some poor whites who were really bad. And the better element, as I call them, a little bit sarcastically, the business people of Troy and of Enterprise tried to keep the lid on because they knew it was not good for business if there were lynchings and castrations and much less of a white lawyer. So that throughout the book, there's this conflict between some of the rough white element who wanted to string up my father and the business people of Enterprise who just kept trying to keep the peace. It's sort of like a dilemma in Syria now where you've got to kind of feed both sides to keep your head above water. Early on the morning of July 14, 1938, Charles White arrived back in Troy, escorted from Montgomery's Kilby prison, the newspaper reported, by 14 members, a double detachment of the Alabama Highway Patrol. This group was met just outside of town by two more state patrolmen stationed in Troy, bringing the grand total to 16. Pike County Sheriff B.R. Reeves, I think you know that family, and two deputies drove out to meet the state officers, bringing chains that turned out to be unnecessary, as Charles White had been shackled ever since he was removed from his cell in Montgomery. Owing to the intervention of Judge Parks with the patrol commandant in Montgomery, all 16 would remain at the courthouse throughout the trial to ensure perfect order. 3 elderly Pike County Negro men dressed in their Sunday suits had come to the courthouse at the invitation of Judge Parks. Again, Judge Parks seems to want to do the right thing. And they stood outside, but near the front door, as the town milled around outside, the rest of the town being white, or the rest of the town that came to the trial. A teenaged white boy they couldn't all get in. They filled up the court immediately. And a teenage white boy was assigned to stand in the back of the courtroom, pay close attention, and run out to report as developments warranted to the more than 100 white men who could not find a seat and would have to wait in the foyer outside. Through prearrangement by Judge Parks, again, Judge Parks, good man, The 3 elderly Negroes were ushered inside separately by Sheriff Reeves and directed to an area in the back where they could stand out of the way and observe. To everyone's relief, the Negroes politely declined the offer of chairs. I don't think Judge Reeves wanted to bring chairs, from what I could surmise from my father, but he was at least a good sheriff and brought him in and gave him a place to watch. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the trial. Some of the transcript of the trial, I won't say it's offensive to our ears given the presidential campaign we're going through. It's mild, but certainly to some of the ladies of Troy who were ushered outside the courtroom during the testimony, the language was a little bit on the edge. And it's ironic because the only thing they were talking about was female anatomy, something that women well knew and knew those words, but they couldn't hear them in the presence of these men. Or some of them couldn't. Some got to stay. Depended. Elizabeth Elijah took the stand, was sworn in, said, I'm 20 years old, I'll be 21 this September 17. I'm not going to read all of her testimony. She talked about her desire to have her fortune told. She wanted to get married. She had an idea of the kind of house she wanted, and she wanted nice furniture. Charles White was reputed to be the world's greatest fortune teller. And so that's how they got introduced to one another, through an African-American woman who was best friends with Elizabeth Elijah. You know, in the South that I grew up in, and many of y'all looking around with gray hair did too, you know, there were a lot of friendships among blacks and whites back then. And Elizabeth Elijah, best friend probably, was this African-American woman, Marietta Bray, who was later indicted herself and sent to prison as a co-conspirator. Crazy. I'm not going to read all that. I'll just get to some of the point. I'm not going to read all of this either. This book was launched at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. We had a good crowd, including my wonderful daughters. And I read a little more than I'm going to read today. And my older daughter told me, Dad, why did you read that? She said, I was crimson. I had a lot of friends there. So I won't embarrass her. She's in her mountain house this weekend, but I will not read that part, but I'll read some of it. This is Ms. Elijah. After he got through telling my fortune, he told me to come over to his side of the table where he was sitting. When I got over there, he pulled up my dress and took some kind of salve and put it on me right down there, indicating, the transcript recorded, on my private parts. Did he do anything else to you on that Tuesday? He told me to get on the bed. He was going to fix me up. And I told him no, he wasn't going to fix me up there on the bed, and he got on top of me. He pulled up my clothes and pulled off one part of my shorts. I cried, but it didn't do any good. I could feel something stinging down there, a stinging and a funny and burning feeling down there, and I asked him to get off me, but he would not do it. And every time I cried, he put his hand over my mouth and said, if you tell anybody, I'm going to kill you. He was lying on top of me, and he was just so big and fat. He hurt me where he lay on me. The state then asked the following question, did you see him undo his clothes? The defendant objected to this question as leading, the transcript recorded, but there was no ruling by the court, so she went on and testified. Yes, I saw, and I know what a man's private parts are. Yes, I saw him do something about that. He got it out and stuck it in mine. I couldn't tell how far because, you see, I was looking the other way. I'm not going to read more of that. Now, I know besides my friend Morris Dees, and I'm sure others in the room, Joel, are a great lawyer from y'all. You're from Eufaula, right? Yeah. This is, if you have a case in Eufaula, this is Man City, or anywhere in that part of the state. If you have a case like this, I didn't do much. I did some criminal antitrust work, which is, white collar crimes, not the same thing. But if you have bad testimony on direct, you don't want them to just say, now, did he really rape you? Did he? Tell me how you don't know. They've heard that. You don't want them to say it again. So you got to think of something else to say. My father, we doing all right?
Oh, yeah, your mic's just a little.
You're
good now.
It's good? All right. If you can't hear me at any point, raise your hand. And if you don't, then I'll assume you're nodding off maybe. It's all right, too. Anyway, first of all, it turned out that she had come to see Charles White on Monday, not Tuesday. not once, but twice. And she claimed that this business with the salve went on both times. And then she came back a third time, which makes you wonder about the topic of consent. Now, there were 3 doctors called, one of whom had never really talked to her, the other of whom had never examined her. The one doctor who did examine her after the alleged crime was also called. He was a graduate of Tulane Medical School. And I want to tell you a little bit about what he said, if I can find it quickly. I thought I had it marked. Oh, here it is. This is Dr. W.P. Stewart. I think you know that family too. Prominent physician there. I was called to her house and went there and examined her on the bed. Now, this is a difference with Mockingbird. Atticus Finch bemoaned the fact in that fictional work that no doctor was called to examine Mayella, but the doctor was called to examine Elizabeth Elijah. With the afternoon of the alleged incident, with the help of her sisters, we put her in the tub and gave her a douche. Upon examining her private parts on that occasion, I found her hymen, commonly known as maidenhead, was thick, that it had not been penetrated, it had not been broken. He went on to say on cross-examination, no, I would not say that a young lady who desired a fortune told, that would indicate an abnormal mind. This question I love. He says, I would not say that a young lady who wanted to get married would necessarily indicate an abnormal mind either. Yes, I made a thorough in response to my father's questions. I made a thorough investigation of her private parts. I didn't detect any injury whatever. This is the part I was going to skip over. But he describes the vagina area and the parts, and he says, I looked at all of them, and they were not injured at all. I didn't detect any blood or other evidence of injury to those parts. I didn't see any bruises or detect any indication of violence on any part of her body. Now, that testimony, as I was told, I was of course not there, was explosive. The stereotypical view that some white men have about some black men being better endowed, this just didn't add up. 250-pound guy, skinny little white girl, didn't break her maidenhead. That doesn't sound like forcible rape to anybody. So the judge knew that, and he knew what they were thinking. And I go into what I was told was said. He called the lawyers, sent the jury out for a while, and he called the lawyers and said, told the solicitor, he says, this is going to land up a hung jury. There's no way all 12 of those men are going to think this is a forcible rape. And I'll have to retry it, and if I do, I'm going to get a smart solicitor from Montgomery, which the one he had was perfectly good. He was a good lawyer, but he was just bullying him because the judge did not want to retry this case. And he turns to my father and he says, Foster, there's no way all 12 are going to vote for him to be innocent, to acquit. And so it'll be retried. Now, I don't want that, and that's not in your client's interest. Here's what we need to do. Mr. White needs to enter a plea. I will give him a guarantee of a short sentence and parole, and we'll be done with this. And the solicitor did not want to hear of it. He had ambitions, so I was told, to run for lieutenant governor. He wanted a rape case scalp on his belt. My father was very much in favor of this. He knew that Charles White was a dead man sooner or later, unless they took this deal, because the rate of executions of black men charged with raping white women, as the Equal Justice Initiative here in Montgomery has documented, was extraordinary. Over 400 blacks were executed for rape, 2 whites, and the 2 white men who were executed were also convicted of murder. So for them to be executed, they had to rape and murder. So Daddy knew that Charles White was going to be a dead man unless we took the deal. He met with him, and it's one of the most fascinating things that I've had to reconstruct from what he told me, and as best I can imagine. I'm not much of a criminal lawyer outside the antitrust area, but I think this is the way it went. Daddy said, do this. Charles said, I'm going to testify. Daddy said, no, you're not. That's not going to be helpful. Charles said, I'm going to do it. And Daddy says, if you have any prior convictions, Charles said, I told you I had none. Daddy said, yeah, but I looked it up. You did. And it's interesting. Daddy said Mr. White was not angry with him for disbelieving, but kind of liked the fact that his lawyer had worked that hard to look up his prior record. And he had 2 prior convictions, one for burglary and one for armed robbery up north. And that was going to come in if he testified, because it would then go to impeaching character. But if he didn't, if he took the 5th and didn't testify, they could not bring that up. And my father didn't want him testifying because, you know, he's being charged with rape, not burglary, but still 2 prior felonies. Doesn't look good. And White said, I'm going to tell, if that cracker, as he called him, that cracker district attorney calls me out and asks if I had a prior conviction, I'll say no. And Daddy said, well, I'm going to have to ask you first, so it won't look like we're covering it. He says, well, if you ask me, I'll say no. So he's, in effect, going to commit perjury. He's staring my father down. You got to let me testify and just let me handle it. And he outsmarted him, my father. And they said, all right, let's go over what you're going to say. And so they did. And his testimony is wonderful to read. It's reproduced in some detail in the book. It's the transcript, thanks to Ed, is even longer. It goes on about 10 pages. My father said he spoke in a tone and with a demeanor he had not seen before. He was calm. He demonstrated truthfulness as he testified. I'll just read the last paragraph. He's speaking now extemporaneous, wasn't even a question pending. That is all that happened down there. I never did lock the door. I did not put any salve on her private parts. I didn't even put my hands on the white lady. I didn't put her down on the bed. The lady treated me nice. She made me no advances. I treated her white. And it's one of the sentences I wasn't sure I had time, but I'll read. I wasn't ever scared when she was in there. That's an interesting comment. You know, for a black man to be in a room behind a closed door with a white woman could have been really scary for him, because if she made it come on to him and he didn't do what she wanted, he could be in serious trouble, and there were going to be questions anyway. But he wasn't scared. In other words, they got along. They were talking about fortune telling. Notice he says, I did not put any salve on her private parts. I wonder what really went on. He was a healer, among other trades, fortune teller, healer. He probably had some salves in his medicine bag, and he may have given her that. And what a woman would do with that at that time, I leave to women of the audience to speculate or inform. But I think that could have been what went on. That Elizabeth Elijah had some second thoughts about doing whatever she did with that salve in his presence, and decided, and maybe even told Marietta about it, and the two of them laughed, and then maybe Ms. Elijah became concerned. I don't know, and I'm not trying to disparage her. She was probably terrified herself. But she turned on him and said something that wasn't true. And so I'm not going to read how it came out, because it may be some people who want to know. But if I had time, I'd love to read a paragraph about my mother. Do I have time, or do we stop for questions?
You have about 8 minutes.
8 minutes, I can do it. My mother, Bertha Beck, was named Bertha Stewart. It was her maiden name. She was born in a town called Wilgufka. Anybody ever been to Wilgufka? Have you? No kidding. There's not much there left, is there? There wasn't much there then. I think there were 5 stores then, and I went back just on a sentimental journey, and I think there were just 2. But it was a magical kingdom for me as a boy growing up there. I used to go up there hunting and fishing. My mother her father was, believe it or not, a very progressive Southern white man. The Stewarts did not fight for the Confederacy, his parents did not, because they had no slaves and they saw no point in it. So they were part of that. They weren't as far north as Wilcox County, but they were part of that Southern white group that just said, to hell with it, I'm not going. The early draft resistors. My grandfather named his oldest son Abraham Lincoln Stewart. It's a hell of a name to go to Auburn with back then. But that's what he did. He became a vet, and after that he went by Doc Stewart. And he ironically lived in Fitzgerald, Georgia, which is sort of known as the blue-gray town. That's where the Yankee Army stopped in Fitzgerald. And most of the Southern men of age to marry were either dead or in prison or lost in the woods. The Yankees looked around and saw all these beautiful Southern white women and said, "We're staying here." And they married, and so they call it the blue-gray town because there's a lot of marriages between Northerners and Southerners. That's where Abraham Lincoln Stewart practiced his veterinarian business. But it's interesting that he would have named his son that. It's also interesting that his second son was named William Seward, who was, of course, Lincoln's Secretary of State. And Mr. Stewart sent, and I know this is true because I've heard it so many times, sent a pillow to Eugene Debs in the Atlanta Penitentiary. Y'all remember Eugene Debs was a socialist who was convicted and hunted down by the FBI and sent to prison for being a socialist. And today, I guess that would get Bernie. But Debs, my grandfather was not a socialist. He was a capitalist, a farmer, a mailman, a scientist. But he thought Debs was wrongfully convicted, so he sent him a pillow so he'd be more comfortable in prison. So that was my mother. Now, she was a great school teacher, and she moved to Enterprise at Jane's mother's urging to meet my father. And Jane's mother, Aunt Frances, is a marvelous character. I hope I do her justice in the book. She wanted Mother and Daddy to get together, and my father was unaccustomed to being of interest to women at that time, but he was a young single lawyer, and so he was sort of looking around, and he kept putting off marrying Mother, and she got more and more impatient. She was teaching there in Enterprise. I got a call about 6 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, from a woman who lived in Enterprise, who's 93 years old. And she said, "I was there." And I said, "Oh my gosh, well, tell me about it. What was my father like?" And she said, "Well, I only knew your father to see him." It's a funny way to put it. I only knew him to see him. She was a teenage girl, and my father was a young lawyer, and she didn't pay him any mind. But she said, "Mr. Beck, your mother was the best teacher I ever had. I went to college and graduate school. She taught King Lear and Othello and Hamlet to us, and it gives me chill bumps to think that poor little school back then, people up north, you mentioned where I went to law school, they would never believe that Othello and King Lear and Hamlet were taught in a town called Enterprise, Alabama, but they were taught and well taught." And as I write in the book, one of my cases, I was at the Commerce Club in Atlanta, I was across the street from the courthouse, and sitting with an older, better-known lawyer, and somebody at a different table came over and asked the better-known lawyer, he says, "Is that Joe Beck with you?" And he said, "Yep." And he said, "Mr. Beck, I was your mother's pupil in Eclectic, Alabama, back in the 1930s, best teacher I ever had." I heard that over and over. I heard that a law partner at Covington Burling, the great Washington, D.C. law firm, every year would send Mother a present. But let me read this, and you raise your hand where's my minder? You tell me if I go too far. I'll try to read fast. "When it comes to my mother's reputation as a teacher, what I remember most of all is her funeral here in Montgomery. After my younger daughter played a composition on the piano in the Methodist church, I walked toward the pulpit. The new preacher who had been transferred to our church during my mother's final 2 years in an Atlanta nursing home had not known Mother, and so she asked me to say a few words. And I remember thinking, the minister is a woman, the first female preacher in that church. My mother would have been so proud. As I was about to begin speaking, I saw 4 elderly guests, 3 women and 1 man, come hobbling down the aisle on walkers looking for an empty pew. I stepped down from the pulpit to meet them. And when I asked how they knew my mother, one of the women, whose name was Mabel, said she had been a student in Eclectic. Of course, I asked her to tell the congregation about Mother. And here's what she said from the pulpit. Ms. Beck, I called her Ms. Stewart in those days, knew I loved books, loved to just handle books, but we didn't have any books on our farm, So she let me begin staying after class to reshelve books in the school library. In the church in Montgomery, Benny, you know that church where you and I grew up. In the church in Montgomery that day of my mother's funeral, you could have heard a pin drop. I knew I was transfixed. One afternoon, Mabel said, and this is an elderly woman with a shaky voice, and her voice caught and she trembled, but continued. I'd finished reshelving the books and was leaving to go home. Miss Stewart called out, Mabel, what's that book you're taking with you? I showed the book. Miss Stewart fussed at me, Mabel, that's not a big book. I want you to read big books. Mabel again stopped and caught her deep breath. Miss Stewart took that book from me and laid it aside and took me by the hand to a shelf and said, this is the sort of book you should read from now on, Mabel. This is a big book. For a moment, Mabel's nervousness seemed to have returned, but then she plunged ahead. The book Miss Stewart gave me was the Forsyth Saga. It was a big book, all right. It took me nearly a month to get through with all the work I had to do at home, but by the time I got through with it, I had come to understand what Miss Stewart meant by telling me about it being a big book, not just a long book. From that time on, I did as she said and only read big books. Mabel looked at the congregation, then turned to the first woman to be a minister in the church and said, Miss Stewart changed my life. That was my mother. So I'd love to hear your questions. I hope you'll have some. I spoke about this in Nashville this past weekend on C-SPAN. I don't know whether that scared people off or they were suffering about the Alabama-Tennessee game or what. But I hope y'all will have some questions. I'd love to take them on. And anybody who buys a book, and again, I'll be glad to sign it.
If anybody has a question, please raise your hand, and either Georgia Ann or myself will pass you the microphone. We're recording this, so we have to make sure everybody can hear.
So the alleged crime actually took place in Troy,
Yes, sir.
and then your father was practicing in Enterprise.
That's right.
Okay.
They were in the same judicial district. Enterprise is in Coffee County, Troy is in Pike County. And there was a question of whether the judge had the power to appoint my father, and he could have gotten out of it either on that ground or others. But they were in the same judicial circuit, and so Judge Parks had seen him try a case or two. My father's first case was not very auspicious. He represented a moonshiner, picked a jury full of Baptists, and the courthouse watchers, these guys who sit around courthouses, Daddy wrote in his book, says they really laughed at the young lawyer, my father. He said, Foster, that jury would have convicted Jesus Christ. All right. Oh, all right. Dr. Vickery?
Dr. Vickery, are you ready?
We're going here. Okay. Thought I'd been passed over again, Joe. I can't help but think, as you speak here today, of all the teachers that you had in the Montgomery Public School System who would have been very proud of your presentation and of the work itself. And I'm wondering, of all the teachers you had in the grades that you went through, and I think it was all of them,
Morning View, Temple Heights, and Lee.
Yeah. Which ones do you think, now as you reflect back, had the greatest impact on your writing facility, which is the one that gets us all in the end? But any stand out as the ones that might have had that kind of impact?
Honestly, it was the teacher that I had at home, not in the schools. It was my mother. I thought you were going to ask which teacher had the greatest impact, and after thinking about it for half a second, I was going to say Miss Tisdale, my second grade teacher, because Miss Tisdale was the first one to send me out to the hall, and that was an unbroken record year after year from that time on. I got 4 P's in self-control and conduct, and that meant poor, not satisfactory, not perfect. I had a teacher named Miss Bumpers. Anybody have Miss Bumpers? Is she here? Is she? You had her? Well, you should talk about her too. Marion Bumpers was a single lady, taught the 3rd grade. She sent me out in the hall a few times. On one occasion, as I was telling Benny, I was out in the hall, and this time I was the only felon, and my mother taught up the hall in the 6th grade, but she wanted to teach high school, but after Enterprise, it was not afforded to her, so she taught sixth grade in Montgomery. She comes strolling down the hall and sees me. Oh boy, here goes. She says, well, what is it this time? I said, well, I'm running for office. And she said, where's the other candidate? So she got me. And Miss Bumpers remembers that story. She lives in Grove Hill, Alabama now. I have her phone number if you'd like to give her a call. And I was hoping she could come. She told me, she said, I've got the gout, Joe, which is not fair. And but she did I sent her a book. I remember I had an uncle who fought in the Pacific Islands in World War II. And he brought back a Japanese rifle and a hand grenade. And in the third grade, we were invited to bring something from home. I brought them to school. Today, I don't know what they would do to a third grader. But back then, everybody, oh yeah, that's a cute, let me see that rifle. And they're pointing at people. And the hand grenade, somebody took. I didn't get it back. So I just hope nobody was hurt, because I don't know if it was ever exploded. It's sort of like I write about, one of the characters I write about, and I think Anne and Jane have forgiven me of this. I'm not sure all my cousins have, but my grandfather, Madison Lewis Beck, was an extraordinary character, Mr. M.L. as he was known. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about him if I may, but I want to answer a question quickly about my grandfather. He had a museum in his sitting room in Glenwood, Alabama. All kinds of artifacts, lots and lots of books. And there were a couple of Confederate muskets hanging up above the fireplace, but we could not touch them because nobody knew if they were loaded. And they were afraid to find out. There's more about him if we have time. Yes, sir.
As you mentioned, Harper Lee's father was editor of the Monroe Journal in Monroeville.
Yes.
In your newspaper research, did you discover whether or not the Monroe Journal ran any stories about this case?
I sure tried to find it, and I couldn't. All I have is Ms. Lee's recollection of not recalling it. It was in a lot of papers, and I'm not sure. I don't think they had the archives that we have here. Didn't you look for that? I think you did, but I don't think it was. We couldn't find anything in that paper. I take Harper Lee at her word that she doesn't recall it. She wrote a magnificent book, and my book is, my book is nonfiction. I'll give it that. Whether she heard about it or not, but I'll tell you. Let's see another hand. I'll tell you a little bit of a war story. Back about less than 10 years ago, but a few years ago, I was hired by a publisher from Boston, Houghton Mifflin, to defend a book called The Wind Done Gone, which was a parody of Gone with the Wind. The estate of Margaret Mitchell hired one of the most famous lawyers in the world, a guy who represents Václav Havel and Philip Roth, and he brings a lawsuit in Atlanta. And Morris, you know how it is in these cases. They file the suit on Thursday, and they're in court. You're supposed to be in court Monday. You got no weekend at all to try to get ready to stop an injunction. Which I didn't think you could do it under the First Amendment anyway, but I wanted to put forth the best case I could. So I'm just scrambling to get witnesses. I got Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner. I got Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard. So I had some good witnesses. And the Boston publisher called me at home over the weekend and said, how about Harper Lee? I said, are you kidding? And it was about 2 years after I wrote her, or maybe a little longer. And I've often wondered, did Ms. Lee, who was a notorious recluse, she did not talk to the press, didn't go out at all, maybe remembered that correspondence and maybe had a little more memory of my father's case, maybe not, I don't know. But I was struck by the fact that she volunteered to testify for me. And I don't know, and she's deceased now, unfortunately. I don't know if that was it or if maybe she just was sympathetic with the African-American woman who wrote The Wind Done Gone. But it was a great case. No other questions. I'll tell you a funny Pat Conroy anecdote about the case. But I'd rather have a question. Yes, sir.
One quick question. Thanks for your comments, especially your feelings.
Thank you.
But can you tell us about the photograph that you chose for the cover?
I didn't really choose it. They called me from New York and they said, what do you want? I didn't know. I said, I don't want any hangman's nooses and I don't want any Spanish moss. I don't want a stereotypical slam the South because I really am a Southerner. And so they came up with this, and I thought that was kind of pretty. I have no input. They also came up with the title. I wanted to call the book Conviction. and as a sort of a double entendre, and not place so much on the Atticus thing, although, you know, their people said, no, this is the way to go, son. Yes, ma'am.
Well, why do you think, and this is for your opinion, like when black men were accused of rape, the majority of the time they were either hung or sent to prison or put in the electric chair, and vice versa with black women? Why were they always not believed? And if they went to court, their case was thrown out. Such was the case with my mother. She was raped by 2 white policemen here in Montgomery, and her case went to trial, and eventually it was thrown out.
Well, I suspect you know the answer, and I'm ashamed of the answer. It's necessary to justice that you have a representation of the community, and that includes black people, white people, men, women. You know, there are some rape cases that ought not to be brought, I'm sure, and we do have a presumption of innocence, and that's a good thing. That means we believe that it's better that 100 guilty men get away than 1 innocent man go to the electric chair. But that doesn't explain what happened in your mother's case at all, and my guess is that it was just not a proper prosecution of the case by the state. And that's a shame. And you've got a great lawyer here in Morris Dees, and there's a group here called the Equal Justice Initiative. I don't know the gentleman, although he's also a Harvard Law graduate, African-American guy. I have his book. But you ought to talk to them. Maybe you've got a story to write.
It was a big case back here.
Yeah, it must have been heartbreaking. Yeah, well, back then, you know, a shame. I'm sorry.
We have time for one last question.
I'm a Citadel grad. Tell the Pat Conroy story.
You know Pat. Many of you know Pat, know who he is, know his books. I'd known him when he was in graduate school with my wife, and we got to be friends socially for a while, and then he just, you know, took off like a rocket with his career. And I'm peddling around Atlanta as a lawyer, and we get this case in which I briefly described that the author, African-American woman Alice Randall, had gone to Harvard herself and graduated with honors back before everybody up there graduated with honors. And she moved back to the South, and the first thing she did was to write, I'm going to get to Pat in a second, but I want to tell you a little bit about her in the book. First thing she did was to write a song for Trisha Yearwood that went to #1 on the chart, country song, black woman writing it. And then she remembered when she was a 12-year-old girl, she read Gone with the Wind and loved the book. But she thought, so she testified, that there was no reference to, she used the term mulatto. I think now a politically correct term is mixed race. I'm going to say mixed race, but whichever. She said there were no mixed race people in the book. They were either black slaves or white plantation people or other white people. And she knew that was not the true story or the whole story. So she wrote a book called The Wind Done Gone, in which a fictional character named Sonara kept a diary of life on the plantation at Tara. And as she kept that diary, and it's fictional, of course, she was keeping an eye on Scarlett O'Hara. And Scarlett probably should have kept an eye on her, because sooner or later she takes Rhett Butler away from Scarlett, and he becomes her husband. She writes in her diary that Ashley Wilkes was a homosexual who slept with slaves. I remember some people said, yeah, I sort of thought that too. And there were lots of other things. There was a character in Gone with the Wind called Pork. You probably would not remember him because he was a caricature. He had no persona. He was the manservant of Gerald O'Hara. He was won in a card game along with the plantation in St. Simon's Island. And so, you know, Pork was just there to do whatever Gerald O'Hara said. But in The Wind Done Gone, his name was changed to Garlic. And he's manipulative, he's smart, he's cagey, he's a human being. And he winds up owning Tara. So that's a bit of the story, just a bit of the story. The Wind Done Gone. And that book might have sold 10,000 copies in Southern literature and African American studies classes, if that. But then they get sued by the Whale, the estate of Margaret Mitchell, and they brought it in Atlanta thinking that's the prime home ground for people who love Margaret Mitchell. And I was hired to defend. And I'm scrambling, as I said, to try to come up with witnesses and evidence and trying to explain to this judge, you cannot enjoin a book. That's the First Amendment. You got to let it be published. And he was not convinced. And I turned his head, and I turned the 11th Circuit's head and got out of this mess with Pat Conroy's help. I'd been trying to call Pat, and his New York agent, some lawyer from Alabama or Georgia, somewhere down there, and she didn't pay much attention to me. And finally, though, I'm at the Commerce Club again for lunch, and they go there that often, but the maitre d', I guess it was, came over and said, Mr. Beck, I have a phone call here from someone who says his name is Pat Conroy. He said he's on a sailboat off the coast of Turkey. What do you want me to tell him? I said, give me that phone. I got the phone. Hey, Pat, we're talking. He says, Joe, I read about your case in the New York Times. You got to fight those old guys. They're tough as nails. I hope you kick their... I won't say what he said. And I said, well, Pat, you can help me. And he said, I'm not coming back to testify. And I said, well, maybe you can put this in the form of a declaration, which, because he didn't have a notary public, and you can say in federal court at the end of a statement that I say all this under penalty of perjury, and it's like an affidavit. So it has that degree of authentication. Pat either didn't hear me or deliberately changed it, but what he sent me was a declaration that said, Joe Beck has my permission to say this under penalty of perjury. So I guess I was the one to go to jail for perjury. But anyway, here's what he said. Here's the story. And all this is recounted in the declaration. He had been hired to write the sequel to Gone with the Wind. I'd read in the New York Times that his contract got canceled before it got signed, and there was some kind of dust-up in New York, and that's what I wanted to hear about. The reason I wanted to hear about it was this. The lawyers for the estate of Margaret Mitchell were taking the position that we had taken, by writing our book, their opportunity to publish a sequel from the point of view of a slave. Yeah, and I'm thinking, there's no way that estate is going to license an aggressive African-American telling, and there's no way that a book with Mammy saying, we don't know nothing about birth and babies and all that kind of talk, that's not going to work in the 21st century. It'd burn down the bookstore. So I knew they weren't going to do that sequel, but I didn't know how to prove it. And all you know is what you know, and you got to prove it. So Pat, here's what he said. So I was hired to write the book, and I go to New York, and we're ready to sign the contract. And I'd given away the money and the rights. I'm doing it for my mother, and they said, Conroy, there are 3 conditions we haven't told you about. And Conroy said, conditions? And they said, no homosexuality, no miscegenation, and Scarlett must never die. He said, look, guys, I'm doing the book for my mother. I haven't written anything yet. It'll be a good book. It's for her. Don't worry about it. But I just can't agree to conditions as a matter of pride. I'm a professional writer. Conroy, these are our conditions. Take it or leave it. Well, the agent said, hey, you guys calm down. Go have lunch. We'll work this out. They came back. I'm sure they had separate lunches. I'm sure Pat had a couple of martinis because I knew him pretty well. And they came back and they said, Conroy, conditions are unchanged. No miscegenation, no homosexuality, and Scarlett must not die. And before I tell you Conroy's line, which is the best, I remember when I talked about this case at Harvard Law School, they invited me back. Glad to have one of their graduates who did something interesting. And I said that, and I looked out there, and I could tell a lot of the people didn't know what the word miscegenation meant. And I said, y'all don't know what that means, do you? No. Finally, one young woman says, I know what it means. It's misogyny. Think about it. That's kind of an interesting take on it. So, Conroy, no homosexuality, no miscegenation, Scarlett must not die. Conroy says, if those are your conditions, this is the first sentence of the book that I'll write. on the morning after the death of Scarlett O'Hara. Rhett Butler rolled over in bed to face Ashley Wilkes. And he said, Ashley, did I ever tell you my grandmother was black? They said, that's it? You're not writing it? And that was the end of it. But I got all that in. It was double hearsay. It probably shouldn't have been admitted anyway because he wasn't there to be cross-examined, but I got it in that. And I know the judge read it and laughed at it. And, of course, it's not in the opinion. But ultimately, in a unanimous opinion in the Court of Appeals, they agreed. It was really a thrill because when I finished my closing argument, they told me to stay in my place, which is lawyer talk for still a hot bench. And they began whispering. And then finally the chief judge leaned forward and said, Mr. Beck, we agree with you. This injunction was unconstitutional. It was arbitrary, capricious. It'll be lifted immediately. You'll have an order within 1 hour. And he turned to Wendy Stroughton, the publisher, and said, you'll publish your book this afternoon. It was great. And I give Pat some of that credit. I went to his memorial service at Emory about 2 weeks ago, and he's passed away. Any other questions about the book?
We don't have time. I'm
Don't have time?
sorry.
All right.
We went a little bit over. Everybody, thank you for coming, and thank you.